There are no screams in the void, only the sound of dying stars. Across the benighted heavens, the light of once glorious constellations flickers and fades, their brilliance smothered beneath the ash of forgotten empires. So, before we begin this dark journey together, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the Star Wars lore. I noticed that about 98.5% of you watching are not subscribe button, and hitting that subscribe button really helps the channel grow and lets me bring you more of these epic tales if you're hungry for even more Star Wars lore and want to explore other corners of this waste galaxy. Definitely check out my channel. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time is it there. There's something magical about knowing we're all connected across different time zones, sharing these stories together under the same stars. Now get comfortable. Dim those lights, maybe turn on your fan for that gentle background sound. Wrap yourself in your blanket and let's journey into the shadows of Thew Old Republic together. The galaxy weeps in silence, mourning the ruin of what might have been. On Terra, the cradle of all mankind, the sky is fire, and the soil runs black with blood. The spires of the Imperial Palace groan under the weight of ancient burdens, their Gothic towers darken not by night, but by despair. The stars themselves seem dimmer, and in the heart of it all, seated upon a throne that was never meant for life, stands a god who no longer believes in gods. This is not a tale of triumph. It is not a song of heroes and salvation. It is the slow exhalation of a dream dying. This is the story of a father and a son, of love buried beneath duty, of ambition twisted by betrayal, of gods made from men and men broken by gods. And before we begin this final journey, know that you are welcome here. We truly love and care for you. You've wandered into a tale that aches. So tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's begin. He stood within the chamber of the Eternity Gate, alone. The storm outside roared with inhuman rage, raging winds of the warp battering against reality with cruel insistence. Even the Geller fields shuddered. The scent of ozone and blood hung heavy in the air. The golden walls, etched with millennia of sacrifice, flickered with the glow of dying lumen orbs. Only silence dared remain near the figure clad in battle-worn armor that once gleamed like a sun. Now it was dim, dull, cracked. The emperor of mankind did not kneel. He did not tremble. But he did pause. Even gods, it seemed, hesitated before the hour of their undoing. His gaze drifted toward the vaulted ceiling, toward ancient tapestries that bore the symbols of the Legiones Astartes, the 9th Legion, the 14th, the 16th. One by one, their banners had been scorched from the halls, burned not by fire, but by treachery. What remained were phantoms of oaths shattered. And still, he felt it, the tether, the invisible, unbreakable chain between him and his son. Horus. He did not whisper the name. He did not need to. It lived within him like a scar. The boy who had once been hope incarnate, the brightest of the Primarchs, the one who had laughed louder and marched farther than any other. Now a warlord, a traitor, a god in the making, crowned not by love but by hatred. But the Emperor did not hate him, not truly. That was the wound that would never heal. Behind him, the Sigillite waited in the shadows. Malcador, hunched with age and wisdom, watched in silence, hands hidden within the folds of his grey robes. He had said all he could say. The webway was in collapse. The gate was barely holding. The defences were burning. Sanguinius and Dawn fought a war they could not win. And yet the Emperor lingered. "Will you speak to him?" Malkador asked, voice barely more than a breath. "Even now?" The Emperor did not turn. His voice, when it came, was not thunder. It was weariness given sound. "I must. And if he does not listen, then I will listen. One last time." Malkador bowed his head. He did not argue. There were no arguments left that could move this man, not after so many centuries of sacrifice. He turned and walked into the deeper shadows, leaving the Emperor alone before the shimmering threshold that led to the teleportarium. The golden figure stepped forward. His footsteps echoed like the tolling of a distant bell. In his right hand, he carried the sword of untold names, a weapon forged not for killing, but for ending. It did not glow. It simply existed, like gravity or sorrow. His left hand was empty. It had always been empty where Horus was concerned. He stepped onto the platform. The circle of ancient sigils lit with crimson fire. Arcane energies hummed and snarled. Sparks danced in the air like dying fireflies. The machinery groaned beneath the weight of destiny. The Emperor took one last breath, slow and deliberate. Within his mind, memories stirred. Horus laughing on the ash plains of Goro. Horus standing at Ulanor, radiant in victory. Horus asking questions no one else dared ask. And then, Horus bleeding on Davin. Horus roaring on Istvan. Horus becoming more than a son, and far, far less. The Emperor closed his eyes. He did not pray. There were no gods left to hear him. With a sound like the breaking of a star, the teleportarium flared, and the Emperor vanished from the heart of terror. Above, within the blackened void, the vengeful spirit awaited, a fortress ship now possessed. Warp-scarred and terrible, its hull bore wounds that bled shadow. Its decks were slick with ichor and ash. Its heart beat not with engines, but with malevolent will. The eye of Horus burned upon its prow like a second sun, mocking the light of terror. And deep within its sanctum, Horus sat alone upon a throne of ruin. He knew his father was coming. He had always known. The golden threads that once bound them, love, loyalty, belief, had long since frayed. And yet one still remained, the thread of inevitability. His armor pulsed with warp light, forged by demons and desire. His eyes shimmered with the madness of gods. But somewhere, deep, buried, choked in the hollows of memory, he remembered laughter. He remembered a man who had once called him son. Now he waited for that man's judgment, or his mercy. And across the stars, two destinies hurtled toward collision. A god and a son, a dream and a nightmare, an ending that could not be rewritten. Before the storms, before the heresy, before the title of War Master turned to ash in his throat, he was simply Horus, the first, the brightest, the one the Emperor loved most. He had not asked to be first. He had not asked for anything. But the galaxy had offered itself to him like a beast, kneeling before its master, and the Emperor, his father, his god, his dream, had placed a golden hand upon his shoulder and said, "You will lead them." It had felt like light, like purpose, like love. And yet, even in that moment of triumph, Horus had felt something stir in the depths of his soul. A flicker of unease, the whisper of weight rather than wings. He had smiled, of course. He had knelt before his father and taken the burden with pride. But somewhere, buried under layers of devotion, was the first wound. Why me? Why only me? On the black sands of Chthoniya, long before the stars had sung his name, Horus had learned how to survive. He had grown among killers, scavengers, and stone-hearted lords who ruled through fear and silence. But unlike the others, Horus had looked up. He had stared at the stars and wondered, not who ruled them, but why they ruled at all. When the emperor found him, he was already a warlord, young, burning, dangerous. But beneath the hard mask of command, the emperor had seen something else, a yearning. He did not speak to Horus like a master. He did not offer him a throne. He asked for nothing but trust, and Horus, in all his defiant pride, had given it. He had loved his father before he knew what love was. Not the trembling, uncertain love of mortals, but something vast and terrible. Love shaped by purpose, by admiration, by the belief that together they could reshape the stars. Horus was not made for peace. He was made for conquest. And the emperor had given him the greatest war the galaxy had ever known. During the Great Crusade, Horus became more than legend. He became the ideal. The lunar wolves carved paths through the void, their banners white and gold, bearing the weight of righteousness. Worlds fell not out of fear, but awe. Horus spoke to kings like a brother. He spared lives when he could. He wept for what he destroyed. His brothers envied him, not openly, not at first, but Horus saw it in the way they looked to the emperor and then to him. He was the bridge between them, the trusted one, the beloved. When Lorgar faltered, it was Horus who was sent to correct him. When Angron raged, it was Horus who tried to reason with him. When the word-bearers kissed the warp, it was Horus who still believed they could be saved. They loved him too, but none more than the emperor, and none less. It was on Ulanor that the tragedy truly began. The orcs had been crushed, 1,000 systems liberated. Victory had never felt so complete, nor the dream so close to fulfillment. As the smoke cleared and the alien citadel fell, the Imperium crowned its war master. Before roaring legions, the emperor placed a hand on Horus's brow and named him the spear of mankind's will. But in that very moment, the emperor also turned away. He returned to Terra, alone, without explanation, without farewell, without trust. Horus had stood amidst the cheering, watching his father ascend toward the void, his golden silhouette vanishing into the stars, and for the first time, he felt the hollow chill of abandonment. He had been given the throne of war, but not the truth. The Webway Project, the secrets beneath the Imperial Palace, the silence from Terra, the burden of command with none of the answers. He was a son, but no longer a child, and so the whispering began. It was Erebus who first spoke plainly of what others only hinted. The chaplain of the word-bearers carried no sword, no gun, only truths, sharpened like razors. He never claimed Horus was wrong. He simply asked the questions Horus had long buried. Why does the emperor hide from you? Why are you burdened with his wars while he retreats to silence? Why does he not tell you what lies beneath the golden throne? At first, Horus laughed, then he questioned, and then he listened. Erebus was subtle. He did not preach chaos. He did not speak of gods. He spoke of betrayal, of pride, of the pain of sons asked to die for fathers who never speak their names. And Horus, for all his strength, heard him. The emperor felt the tremor. He always had. In the dark, in the warp, in the soul threads that connected him to his sons, he knew something had shifted. Horus had become distant. He no longer reported with eagerness. His messages grew cold. His eyes, once bright with purpose, had begun to mirror the void. But the emperor had no time to reach for him. The Webway Project was failing. Terra was vulnerable. The daemons pressed against the veil of reality. The Mechanicum grew restless. Magnus was already wavering. So the emperor made a choice. He chose the future, and Horus felt it as rejection. Among the lunar wolves, now sons of Horus, there were still those who believed the dream. Captain Loken, Torgadon. Abaddon, though fierce, remained loyal. They sensed the change in their Primarch, the way his words grew colder, more distant, the way he stopped laughing. But loyalty blinded them. When Horus was wounded on Davin, everything changed. The spear had pierced not only his flesh, but his soul. He should have died. Instead, he dreamed. And in that dreaming, he saw a galaxy where the Emperor became a god and his sons became forgotten tools. He saw a golden throne of lies. He saw fire and chains, and a future ruled not by unity, but by tyranny cloaked in righteousness. When he awoke changed, not possessed, not broken, convinced. The warp whispered what he had long feared, that the Emperor would discard him, that the dream of unity had always been a lie, that chaos, change, freedom, ascension was not corruption, but truth. A terrible, violent truth, but one he could control. He would not be a tool. He would not be cast aside. He would burn terror not out of hatred, but to show the galaxy that he had never been less than a god. He would remake the Imperium. He would save humanity by destroying its illusion. He would be what the Emperor had failed to be. And yet, even as the storm gathered, even as he forged pacts and raised banners of rebellion, something within Horus still bled. A memory, a hand on his shoulder, a voice saying, "You are my son. You are my pride." A part of him still hoped his father would explain, still hoped for the words that had never been spoken, still hoped to be loved, not as a weapon, not as a symbol, but as Horus. Now, aboard the vengeful spirit, as the warp coiled and gods watched with burning eyes, Horus sat upon his throne and remembered. He remembered being first. He remembered being loved. And in the deepest silence of his soul, he remembered what it meant to be a son. In the great throne chamber of the vengeful spirit, the shadows never slept. The light came not from lumen strips or sun lamps, but from the raw shimmer of warp energy that pulsed like blood through the walls, writhing in veins of unnatural color. It cast everything in a sheen of unreality. Golden armor looked bronze. Flesh glimmered with hidden cracks. Even time, once a servant of logic, moved here like a dying beast, limping, groaning, pausing between breaths. And seated upon the throne, draped in furs and memory, Horus Lupercal stared at nothing. He was not alone, but he felt alone. Abaddon stood nearby, still and watchful, the Justicar of his legion, and now its executioner. His eyes burned with loyalty, not the blind kind, but the chosen kind. His was a devotion forged in fire, in years of battle, in the legacy of lunar wolves who once bled for a nobler purpose. But Abaddon did not speak. None of them did. The air was too heavy with what Horus had not yet said, what he could no longer say. He remembered a dream from the night before, or perhaps it was a memory. What difference did it make any more? He was on Ulanor again. The sky was crimson with dusk, and the cheers of 1,000,000 warriors shook the bones of the world. The orcs were dead. The war was won. He stood before his father, bathed in glory, the crowd chanting his name. War Master, War Master. The word had sounded like a crown of light, and then the cheering had ceased. The world grew silent. The Emperor turned to him and spoke not with pride, but with farewell. "I have given you everything," he had said. "Now I go to finish what only I can begin." And then he was gone. Just like that. Horus had stood there, surrounded by brothers and banners, laurels and litanies, but the warmth had drained from the world. He realized in that moment he had not been crowned. He had been dismissed. And somewhere deep within the dream, a voice not his own had whispered, "He left because he does not trust you." Horus stirred on his throne, breaking from reverie. The air trembled. "My father feared me," he said aloud, voice low and distant. "Even then." Abaddon tilted his head slightly. "He gave you the galaxy." "And kept terror," Horus replied. "And secrets." "And silence. You were meant to rule in his absence." Horus's eyes gleamed. Absence becomes abandonment. Abandonment breeds doubt. And doubt, Abaddon. Doubt is a seed. Water it long enough, and it becomes truth. He rose slowly. Every movement echoed, as if the ship itself listened with reverence. "I was the first, the brightest, the best." His voice cracked slightly, barely perceptible. "But I was never told why. I was never told anything. Only orders, only silence, as if I were not a son, but a tool." Abaddon remained still. His loyalty was unflinching, but it was not without question. He had followed Horus from honor to heresy, from pride to this realm of whispers and blood and demons with too many eyes. Yet something human still lingered in his gaze. "What would you have done differently?" Abaddon asked, the words quiet, respectful. Horus's lip curled, half smile, half sneer. "I would have spoken to my sons, told them the truth, not left them to puzzle it out while the warp crept through their dreams. I would have taught them what we were fighting for, not just what we were ordered to destroy." He stepped toward the observation port. Outside, the void swirled in colors forbidden by physics. Warp tides crashing against the hull like an ocean of madness. Stars flickered in and out of sight. A great beast of the warp slithered past, unaware, unconcerned. The eye of terror widened, hungry. "I would have ruled," Horus whispered. The doubts had not come all at once. First, there had been inconsistencies. Edicts from terror that contradicted earlier orders. Messages intercepted between the Mechanicum and the Emperor. Strange, coded things about a gate, a key, and a hidden project beneath the palace. Then there had been Magnus's desperate warning, shattered by fury and drowned in fire. A cry through the warp, pleading that Horus open his eyes. Horus had opened them, and had seen chaos. Not the demonic kind, not yet, but the chaos of a dream unraveling. Why had the Emperor abandoned the crusade? Why build a throne for eternity if he had no need for it? Why speak of unity, only to wall himself in silence? Even Erebus, slithering silver-tongued Erebus, had asked him the same question in a voice that slithered through his dreams. If the Emperor was truly divine, why does he bleed when questioned? But the final wound came from Lorgar. Of all the brothers, it was Lorgar who had once stood lowest in the Emperor's favor, castigated for worship, humiliated for devotion. And yet now he was exalted. Lorgar had walked through fire and emerged unburned. He had whispered truths not with bitterness, but serenity. The warp, he said, was not damnation. It was liberation. The gods of chaos were not monsters. They were truths that the Emperor dared not speak. And Horus, alone, burdened, abandoned, listened, not because he wanted to fall, but because he needed to believe that someone understood, even if it meant reaching for madness. In the shadowed halls of the vengeful spirit, the lunar wolves had begun to change. New armor, new symbols. The eye of Horus replaced the howling wolf. Some protested, others obeyed. But even the most faithful could not deny that the tide had shifted. Torgadon had been the first to speak plainly. "We are no longer who we were," he said, frowning. "This path leads to something else, something darker." And Loken, dear loyal Gaviel, had agreed, but their words had fallen on deaf ears. Horus had smiled at them, still wearing the mask of brotherhood, and told them to trust him. Inside he wept. They would never understand. They still believed the dream. Horus now saw the truth. Back on Terra, the Emperor stirred in his vault of silence, his mind 1,000 fragments of strategy and vision. He felt his son's heart turning slowly, like a dying star, but he had no time for grief, no words left for healing. The webway screamed, the demons pressed inward, the future slipped through his fingers like sand. And Horus wondered if the silence meant shame or surrender. As he stood aboard his cursed flagship, Horus looked at his reflection in the blackened glass of the view slit. He no longer saw a warrior. He no longer saw a son. He saw something becoming, something ancient, something necessary. He touched the eye emblazoned upon his armor, his voice almost inaudible. "They call me traitor." He closed his eyes. "But I am truth." Behind him, the walls pulsed with unseen life. Somewhere in the bowels of the ship, cults chanted forbidden litanies. Astartes sacrificed oaths for power. The warp grinned, but Horus stood still. For all the power he had seized, all the legions he had turned, all the gods that now whispered in his veins, there was still one thing he wanted: to look his father in the eyes and be heard, be understood, be seen. There was a time when Horus Lupercal wore no armor, a time before the titles, before War Master, before Arch-Traitor, before Chosen of Chaos, a time when he was merely a boy, cradled in the hands of destiny and raised beneath the unblinking stars. He had laughed freely then, not in mockery but in wonder, gazing up at the ships that crossed the void above the training grounds of Chthoniya. And the Emperor, his father, his creator, had watched with pride hidden beneath his golden mask. How strange that the boy who had once dreamed of peace would become the architect of the galaxy's greatest war. But perhaps that was always the price of love in a world like this. On the bridge of the vengeful spirit, the demon light cast flickering shapes upon the blackened steel. The walls breathed, the consoles pulsed like veins beneath skin. The ship no longer responded to logic or code, only to will and wrath. It was an extension of Horus now, as much a part of him as the curved talons that had replaced his gauntlets. He stood before the great viewing canopy, the void stretching before him like a wound that would never close. Beyond, the throne world burned. Terra, once a beacon of unity, was now little more than a scar of fire and ruin. The orbital defenses were crumbling. The Legio Mortis had descended. Titans walked across the broken crust of ancient continents. Blood angels and imperial fists fought inch by inch, breath by breath. Humanity screamed, but Horus heard only silence. He was waiting, and he was remembering. The Lupercal had not always been so still. There had been passion in him once, brilliance beyond measure. His brothers had felt it too. Even those who had despised him had respected his mind, his leadership. Fulgrim had envied it. Mortarion had begrudged it. Russ had challenged it. Gilliman had feared it. And Sanguinius. Sanguinius had loved him. But all of that had been before Davin, before the wound that had never healed. There are wounds that flesh cannot bear, and then there are wounds that pierce the soul. The Davinite priests had known exactly what to offer, a lie draped in the skin of truth. They had whispered what Horus had feared but never said aloud, that his father had lied to them, that the Emperor sought apotheosis not for unity, but for dominion, that the Webway project was not a path for all humanity, but a throne for one man alone. And in the moment of weakness, bleeding, delirious, alone. Horus had believed them, not because it was true, but because it felt true, because in his heart he had already begun to doubt. And doubt, in a galaxy built on faith, is death. A shape stirred behind him. Erebus. The word-bearer moved like a shadow, his armor lined with the twisting glyphs of the dark tongue. The snake that had first whispered into Horus's ear now coiled at his side, ever watchful, ever smiling. "He comes," Erebus said. "The Emperor has entered the vessel. He walks alone." "I know," Horus murmured. His voice was deeper now, layered with echoes of things that had never been human. "He always walks alone." Erebus tilted his head, curious. "Will you kill him?" "I already did," Horus replied. "The moment I turned against him, he began to die. This is just the final breath. Then why wait?" Horus turned slowly, his gaze piercing. "Because I want him to see." "To see what?" Horus looked once more toward Terra, toward the world that had birthed them both. "I want him to see what his truth has wrought." In the corridors of the ship, the Emperor walked through shadows that screamed. The walls whispered lies. The air shifted with illusions. Demons clawed at the edge of perception, shrieking names they had torn from the minds of dead men. But he paid them no mind. He walked with the silence of inevitability, the gravity of final judgment. Around him, the vessel shuddered, not in resistance, but in fear. He was not a warrior now, not merely. He was a flame, and the darkness fled before him. With every step, he remembered. He remembered lifting Horus from the wreckage of Chthoniya. He remembered the way the child had reached for him, not with reverence, but with joy. He remembered laughter and questions and curiosity unbounded by fear. He remembered the first time Horus had called him father. He remembered how proud he had been. And he remembered when that pride became regret, for he had built his sons as weapons, and weapons in the end only know how to destroy. The doors of the sanctum opened with a groan that echoed across time, and there they stood, father and son. The Emperor stepped forward, robes billowing, the sword of untold names at his side, sheathed but awake. Horus remained seated upon his throne, the eye of terror burning upon his chestplate, a cruel echo of the Imperium's sigil. His eyes glowed like dying suns, but somewhere within them, a flicker, a question unspoken. Neither moved, not yet. "Why?" the Emperor asked at last, not as a god, but as a man. Horus did not smirk, he did not mock, he spoke with the voice of memory. "Because I loved you." The words struck like a thunderbolt. "And you broke me," Horus continued. "You made me believe. You made me trust. And then you chose to hide everything. You raised us to be brothers and lied to every one of us. You made Gilliman a bureaucrat, Mortarion a jailer, Angron a beast, Kurz a weapon. You abandoned us, one by one, to make yourself divine." "I never wanted divinity," the Emperor said. "Then why take it?" Horus stood now, slow and immense. Why build a throne of souls? Why chain the warp to your will? You became what you swore to destroy. I became what I had to be, the Emperor answered, because I knew what was coming. I knew what you would become. "No," Horus said. "You made me what I became." The words hung in the air like a sentence passed. They were not spoken with rage, not even with sorrow, only with the stillness of a wound that never closed. And in that moment, the Emperor saw the truth. Horus was not just his enemy. Horus was still his son, still the boy who had asked why stars died, still the boy who had once believed. And the Emperor, for all his power, could not bring him back, because the lie had gone too deep, because the wound had become the man. And now only death remained. Beneath the screaming spires of the imperial palace, past the gold-plated galleries and the halls of martial triumph, there exist chambers known to none but the High Lords and the Emperor's most secretive servants. They are called the Silent Vaults, catacombs not of death, but of memory. Within them echo the thoughts of 1,000 psychers, voices that never stop whispering, long after their bodies have been burned to cinders by the Astronomican's hungry flame. It was here, deep within these cursed vaults, that the truth began to tremble. The Sisters of Silence, voiceless guardians of the soul and the word, knew these corridors well. Once, in another age, they had patrolled the outer chambers, their null auras silencing the screams of dying psychers and shielding the minds of those who worked close to the psychic inferno. But since the heresy, since the throne had grown cold and the Emperor ceased to speak, they had withdrawn, not in cowardice, but in shame. The choir had died on their watch. Only a few returned now, veterans of 10,000 wards, women with eyes like tarnished silver and memories of flame. Among them walked Sister Commander Elandra Vale, the last of her original cohort. Her presence stripped sound from the air as she descended into the vaults, trailing silence like a funeral shroud. She had come seeking ghosts. What she found was a living betrayal. Deep in the vault's lowest chamber, guarded by wards older than the Imperium itself, stood the Black Reliquary, a cube of absolute darkness, suspended in stasis, pulsing like a dying star. It was not meant to be opened, not by hands, not by force, only by thought, and it was already open. Inside, glowing with sullen brilliance, was a memory thread, a psychic recording encoded in soul stuff, stolen from the mind of a dying psyker. The voice that echoed from it was familiar, impossibly so. It was the Emperor, not in his golden age, nor his final silence. This was the voice of the Emperor before unity, before terror, before mankind even dreamed of empire. The voice was tired, ragged, bitter with sacrifice. "I see it all," the voice whispered. "Every thread, every lie, every cost. They think I do not weep, but I built this throne from their bones, and still it is not enough." Elandra fell to her knees, not in worship, but in grief, because she understood in that moment that the black ships had not simply harvested psychers for the Astronomican. They had harvested them for something else, for truth, for memory. The choir had not died merely to guide ships through the warp. They had died to fuel the Emperor's remembrance, a monument of voices built from souls. And someone, somewhere, was tampering with that remembrance. Elsewhere, far from the vaults and their silent dirges, an inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus, known only as Kestel, received a fragment of encrypted data. It was unsigned, its source untraceable, but it bore a sigil he had seen only once before, on the body of a Sister of Silence who had burned herself alive rather than speak. The message was brief. "The vaults remember. The choir is not silent. Seek the ones who walk without echo." Kestel felt the weight of ancient crimes pressing on his soul. He looked at the burning parchment, smelled the psychic residue, and realized that the very foundation of the Imperium might rest on a silence bought with agony. Back in the vaults, Elandra extinguished the memory thread, not to destroy it, but to carry it. She placed it within the holster of her soul blade, sealing it with a vow. Never again would the children be stolen in silence. Never again would she watch a choir die. But the path forward would not be through peace. It would be through the ruins of terror and through war. The vaults had opened. The choir had spoken. The emperor had remembered. And now the lie was waking. End of chapter 5. Word count 1638. Would you like to proceed to chapter 6? You said, chapter 6 complete liko, word count por Dana. ChatGPT said, chapter 6, the Inquisitor and the Ashen Creed. Word count 1721. In the deep void between stars, aboard a black vessel that bore no sigil nor name, Inquisitor Kestel meditated within the silence of his sanctum. The fragment he had received, the message bearing the sigil of the Sisters of Silence, was more than a summons. It was a confession written in agony, a key that opened doors better left sealed. He had seen many heresies in his long service, cult worlds drowned in blood and prayer, demon hosts born in the hearts of hive cities, whole regiments of the Astra Militarum undone by a single whisper in the dark. But none had shaken him like this. For if what the message implied was true, then the choir of the Astronomicon had not merely died, they had been betrayed, sacrificed not in service, but in silence, consumed not by warp-light, but by imperial lies. And worse, the lie had become doctrine. The Ashen Creed had first surfaced in the wake of the Great Rift, a shadow movement, half faith, half fragment, whispered between ex-psychers and rogue navigators. They believed the Astronomicon was a false godlight, that the Emperor's flame had long since gone out, and what now burned on the golden throne was not his will, but a ghost light, fed by endless death. To speak of it was death. To believe it was damnation. Kestel had hunted them once across the decaying orbital cities of Ankara Minor. He had burned whole archives and executed 10,000 for even uttering the creed's name. He had stood in a cathedral of rust and watched a last confessor carve into his chest the words, "The lie burns brighter than the truth." Back then, he had dismissed them as heretics. A heresy like any other, madmen clinging to despair. But now, alone in the colder void space, Kestel could no longer be certain. What if the creed were not wrong? What if the flame of the Astronomicon was indeed a monstrous deceit? He opened the memory thread again, copied from the black reliquary by an unknown hand. The voice of the Emperor returned, like thunder buried beneath millennia of dust. I made them sing, not to guide the void, but to remember the stars we burned. I fed them sorrow, so I would not forget what we were. But I do forget. I forget too much, and they suffer for it. I never wanted this throne. Kestel clenched his gloved fists. This was not the voice of a god. It was the voice of a man broken under the weight of his empire, a man who remembered every sacrifice he had demanded and had built a beacon not to guide, but to mourn. The choir were martyrs to memory, their song a psalm of guilt. Kestel knew then that his next course would not be sanctioned. He would be declared apostate by morning if the Ordo Hereticus knew what he had uncovered. So he erased himself, burned his codes, sent his ship into dead space and renamed it Contritio, repentance, his destination, Luna. For hidden beneath the old subcrustal foundations of the moon, in archives forgotten even by the administratum, there lingered relics of the pre-throne era, data crypts untouched since the unification wars. He would go there and he would dig. If the choir's silence was forged in the cradle of empire, then perhaps Luna held the first note of the lie. But he was not alone in seeking the truth. On a forge world forgotten by the stars, where the machine cult whispered prayers to broken code, an archmagos named Leviticus Null had begun his own unholy litany. He had found remains of the Astronomicon's earliest framework, stashed within a vault of Dark Age origin, schematics written not in Gothic, but in a cipher that bled when decoded. What he saw within them was abominable. A blueprint not for a beacon, but for a tomb. The Astronomicon, in its primal state, was never meant to guide ships. It was meant to bind a mind, to hold a will so vast, so ancient, so bright, that it could never be allowed to die. And the cost? 1 million minds each year, devoured to keep the prison sealed. The Emperor was not the jailer, he was the prisoner. And the choir, the chains. Leviticus Null began to transmit, not to Mars, not to Terra, but to those who listened in the dark, the remnants of the Ashen Creed, the exiled Psyker cabals, the ships that drifted without navigators. He sent them a single image, the Astronomicon, not as a flame, but as an eye, closed, bleeding, dreaming, and with it, a single phrase, lifted from the Emperor's buried memories: he who does not forget must never wake. On Terra, deep within the silent vaults, Sister Commander Elandra Vale stood before the broken remains of a forgotten choir chamber. It had once been a place of prayer and death, where young psychers had been brought to sing until they burned. She placed her hand upon the obsidian lectern and whispered a promise through her silence. She would gather the fragments. She would find the others who remembered, and she would prepare for the moment when the lie could no longer sustain itself. Because the choir was waking, and the dream upon the throne would not slumber forever. Beneath the crust of holy terror, far below the shrines and spires of the ecclesiarchy, and deeper still than the vaults of the Mechanicus, there lay a place unmarked on any map. It was older than the throne, older than the wars that forged the Imperium. It had no name now, for even memory recoiled from its presence. The Sisters of Silence called it only the Womb of Stone. It was here that Sister Commander Elandra Vale had returned. Her armour, blackened and bare of sigils, bore no record of her past campaigns. Yet her eyes carried the weight of 1,000 executions, 1,000 silences, enforced. She had been present at the scouring of Ishtar Vive, where a choir of unsanctioned psychers had reached too far into the Sea of Souls and sung their minds into ash. She had stood on the corpse of Cadia and watched the eye of terror bleed across the void. But none of that compared to this place. This was where the first choir was born, and where the first one died. The Womb of Stone was a tomb, a cradle, a secret, carved into the world by the Emperor himself. It had once housed the original Primaris Vox Reliqua, the first attempt to fuse human minds into a single navigational will. These were not the psychers of later generations, drugged, bound, trained for servitude. These were volunteers. Saints, it was said, children in truth. Elandra passed through the archway of Nullstone and descended alone. No custodian guarded the path. No servitor stirred in the dark. Only silence walked with her. She lit no torch. She did not need to. The walls themselves remembered. Memories clung to the stone like soot. Echoes of screams that had never passed through mouths. Of minds breaking apart in perfect harmony. Of songs so bright that they burned holes in the warp itself. At the heart of the tomb was the choral ossuary, a circular chamber lined with bone and gold, its domed ceiling painted with a mural lost to time. The mural depicted stars not yet charted, and at its centre, a sun with no name, a sun that bled. In the centre of the room, on a platform of obsidian, sat a sarcophagus of translucent crystal. Inside, what remained of the first voice. It had no face, no body, only nerves and a skull. The rest had long since withered, dissolved by centuries of warp exposure. Yet its brain pulsed faintly, and the air around it shimmered with suppressed resonance. This was the first child who had sung, the first to burn, the first to whisper, even now, without breath. Elandra removed her helmet, and for the first time in decades, she spoke. Her voice was coarse with disuse, as if words had to claw their way up from a buried grave. "I am sorry. We have forgotten you." The brain pulsed once. She knelt beside the crystal, placing a gloved hand upon its surface. The others are remembering. One by one, the Inquisitor, the Creed, even the Mechanicus stirs. The flame flickers. The lie begins to crack. The chamber pulsed again. Not in light, but in thought. A low vibration spread through the room, like the memory of a scream held beneath water. And then came the thought, not spoken, but imprinted into Elandra's mind like a branding iron. "Do not mourn us. We are not gone. We are the song beneath the song. We are the memory the throne cannot kill." Elandra's eyes burned. She had trained her entire life to resist psychic intrusion. The pariah gene had made her immune to sorcery, to demons, even to the touch of gods. But this was not intrusion. This was recognition. This was legacy. The first voice continued. "They will lie. They will silence us. Again. But you, child of silence, you have no voice to lie with. That is why you were chosen," Elandra stood. The chamber around her shuddered as the psychic residue grew heavier, coalescing into presence. The mural above shimmered, and the bleeding sun at its center began to flare, not with light, but with understanding. She knew what she must do. The fragments scattered across the stars, messages, dreams, encoded songs, were all pieces of the same voice, a collective cry buried beneath 10,000 years of empire. Each fragment had found a keeper, an inquisitor, a tech priest, a navigator gone blind, a mutant cast adrift in the void. Together, they formed a chorus of the forgotten, and that chorus would awaken the dream, not to destroy the Imperium, but to finally remember what it had lost. Elandra returned to the surface. As she passed the threshold, the seals behind her closed forever. The womb of stone would not open again. The first voice had passed its burden. The song had moved on. Above Terra, in the seething clouds that hid the ruined skyline, a single black star fell from the sky. No one noticed. No one looked up. But in the deepest recesses of the palace, the golden throne stirred, not the emperor, but the thing that had grown around him. The apparatus of gold and soul steel, the machinery of binding and death, the impossible architecture of godhood. All of it shuddered, as if in recognition. A faint pulse passed through the psychers chained in the sanctum. Some screamed, some laughed. One died with a smile. The emperor did not wake, but the song did, and across the galaxy the warp trembled, for the Astronomicon was not a lighthouse, it was a lament, and it had just begun the second verse. In the echoing blackness of Segmentum Pacificus, a lone vessel drifted between the stars, a derelict pilgrim bark known as the Sanctity of Virelia. Once a proud bearer of imperial penitence, it now floated in silence, its vox decks cold, its engines flickering with intermittent half-life. But within its steel womb remained one soul who had not yet died, one who had long since ceased to live. Her name was Navigator Lady Sira Ligeia Virelia, scion of a once mighty Navis Nobilite house. Once, her third eye had blazed like a lighthouse in the storm, guiding the bark through the tides of the immaterium with practiced grace. Once, she had been honored, feared, revered. Now, she was blind, not in the way the Mechanicus diagnosed. Her optic nerve still functioned. Her warp eye still opened, though nothing came through. No light, no tides, No astronomicon, only void. Syra sat in the withered throne of her navigator's sanctum, surrounded by cracked auger screens and rusting ley charts. She hadn't moved in weeks. The ship's crew were long dead, victims of warp madness, disease and starvation. She had locked the sanctum before the end. She had heard their screams, then silence. Silence had remained, but in that silence, she had begun to hear it started as a low vibration beneath her bones, a pulse that throbbed not through her flesh, but through the vessel itself, through the metal. The sanctity of Virelia was singing, and Syra listened. The song was not one of words, not of language, but of shapes, of dreams, of memory. It told her things no navigator should know, that the light of the Astronomicon was not eternal, that it had faltered before, that the throne fed not on hope, but on children, and it told her a name, Elandra, a sister of silence with no voice and a terrible burden. She could not explain how she knew these things. They came in bursts of sensation, fractured recollections of lives she had never lived. A cathedral made of bone, a sarcophagus that pulsed, a sun that bled. The song told her she was not alone. All across the Imperium, others were remembering. One by one, scattered across the stars, survivors of buried truths were hearing echoes, pieces of a vast, ancient voice stitched across time and silence. And Syra was the ear, the listener, the one who no longer saw, but now heard what the warp had forgotten. She unbuckled herself from the navigator's throne. Her joints ached from atrophy. Her body, pale and bruised, moved like parchment in a storm. Yet she moved. For the first time in months, she moved with purpose. She knelt before the hololithic map of the stars, and though her mortal eyes saw nothing, her mind's eye bloomed open, not through vision, but through resonance. The song guided her hand. She placed her palm on the control node. The console flickered. The ship, once thought dead, groaned like a beast waking from ancient sleep. Lights flickered in half-dead corridors. Life support surged. Engines coughed. The sanctity of Virelia was alive, but not because of Syra, because something had answered her. The ship no longer drifted aimlessly. It had a destination now, a pulse in the void, a beacon not lit by the Astronomicon, but by the first voice, a memory radiating from Terra's hidden womb, calling across the stars to its scattered children. She knew where to go, but more importantly, she knew who else would come. The Inquisitor, the tech priest, the Sister of Silence, the outcast astropath who remembered the day the Emperor screamed. All of them were part of the same hymn, fragments of a greater psalm, a lament buried beneath the lies of millennia. Syra reached up to her warp eye. It wept blood, for even in its blindness, it had begun to pulse again, not with sight, but with rhythm. The warp itself had begun to throb with dissonance. Somewhere deep in the immaterium, a counter-frequency stirred, a discordant chord buried within the soul of the universe. The Imperium did not yet know, but soon the choir would be impossible to ignore. The Mechanicus would declare it heresy. The Ecclesiarchy would call it demonic. The Inquisition would kill to keep it silent, but the song would not stop. Not now. A faint sound echoed through the control chamber. A voice, not external, but within Syra's thoughts. And it was not the voice of the Emperor. It was older, softer, and more human. You are the listener. You are the vessel that carries the breath of those who were never allowed to speak. We sing not for war. We sing to be remembered. Syra wept. For the first time since her childhood, before the rituals and training, before the horror of warp exposure, and the agony of guided travel, she felt human. No longer a tool, no longer a map, but a voice, a soul. And with the tears came harmony. Around the drifting bark the warp bent, not violently, not with demons or storms, but with recognition. The immaterium, that howling sea of madness, seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath. The ship leapt, not through charted warp lanes, not through the lattice of the Astronomicon, but through memory, through grief, through the long, slow song of the forgotten. And elsewhere, in dark cathedrals and hidden vaults, in the dreams of dying psychers and the final breaths of mute soldiers, others stirred. The pulse was rising. The choir was beginning to assemble, not with banners, not with weapons, but with voices once denied. Beneath the scorched surface of Nocturne, far below the shattered obsidian valleys and ash-choked fire plains, there lay a vault no salamander dared speak of. It was older than the chapter, older than Vulcan himself, and deep within its sealed black doors, behind adamantium wards etched with draconic runes and forbidden Nocturnian glyphs, there was a voice. Not a demon, not a machine, but something in between. A whisperer, a remnant, a cinder of a forgotten flame. For 10,000 years it had waited. Now it stirred. The vault of the last breath was known only to a sacred few. Chapter Master Tushan, the master of the forge, and the one they called Brother Archivist Callum Vor. Vor was not like the other salamanders. He rarely fought in battle. His armor bore no trophies. His skin, dark as the obsidian sands, had never known the branding rights of honor. He spoke little, and always to flame. He was the last ashbinder, an order thought extinct since the heresy. When the pulse came, he felt it, not in his mind, but in his marrow, as if the mountain itself had shivered. He descended into the deep, past the worm-forged locks, past the geothermal tunnels no techmarine dared enter, into the deep chamber where the heat could melt ceramite, but not memory. The vault stood like a tomb, a single monolith of black stone, unmarked, save for a single burning rune, 11. The 11th, not the Legion, but something else. He approached. The rune pulsed with faint firelight, and in that flicker he heard the sound he had not heard since his youth. A lullaby, not in low Gothic, not in Nocturnian, in a tongue spoken only by the dead. He placed his hand upon the vault. It burned and opened. No gears turned, no locks disengaged. It opened not by mechanism, but by invitation. Inside, Vor found only ash, but ash that breathed, and from within the swirling grey dust came a shape, skeletal, luminous, singing not with voice, but with memory. It was not a human, not a Xenos, not a machine. It was a recording, a soul imprint, a preserved echo encoded not in data, but in emotion, and it sang to him. We were the first to hear it, the first to silence it. The Emperor gave us flame, and in flame we burned away the truth. But the truth cannot burn forever. It becomes smoke, and smoke remembers Vor dropped to one knee. He saw, in flashes, a world long destroyed, a creche of children, each bound in silence, an angel in gold placing his hand upon their heads one by one, a vault of bone where voices were kept like relics, and he saw the choir before it was shattered, before it was fed to the throne. He gasped. He understood now what the Imperium had done, what the Emperor had once tried to protect, and what the High Lords had entombed. The Choir of Terror had not simply vanished. They had been sacrificed to fuel the light of the Astronomicon, to guide the fleets, to keep mankind afloat in the warp. It was a necessary sin, a sin so vast it required the silence of 1,000,000 souls to hold it in place. And now, that silence had begun to crack. Vor emerged from the vault with fire in his eyes, not the flame of battle, not the fury of vengeance, but the light of remembrance. He summoned the master of the forge, showed him the rune, spoke the words the flame had whispered, and together they made a choice. They did not tell the chapter master. They did not inform the Ordo Hereticus. They gathered what was needed, a relic no one understood, hidden within Vulcan's own reliquary, a shard of black crystal etched with the same 11 rune, a piece of something older than the Primarchs, a keystone. They affixed it into a modified drop pod, reinforced for interstellar range. They selected coordinates that no star map recognized and launched it into the dark, not with hope, but with faith, because Vor knew now what others were beginning to learn. The choir was awakening, its notes scattered across the Imperium, and each voice had a part to play. He did not know who would receive the shard, but he had seen her in the vision. A woman in armor of silence, a face forgotten by history, Elandra. The keystone was hers, and its song would find her, even if the Inquisition hunted every soul who remembered, even if the throne denied it, even if the warp itself twisted in rage. The choir would be heard again. Far from Nocturne, drifting in the silence between stars, the shard moved through the void, and as it travelled, it sang, not loudly, not with rage, but with the quiet, steady breath of something once forgotten, now beginning to dream. In the cold, forgotten void, where even the Emperor's light struggled to reach, there drifted a moon without name. It was not charted on any star map. It had no beacon, no orbital drift. It hung, motionless in the black like a silent eye, watching nothing. This was not because it was dead. It was because it was hidden. They called it the sepulchre of the untuned. And once, long ago, it had been part of a project that should never have existed. Here, beneath miles of pallid dust and jagged ice, the choir had buried those voices that could not sing. The untuned were not defective. They were not mad. They were simply too different. Their songs resonated not with the Astronomicon, but with something deeper, something that even the Emperor feared would awaken if disturbed. They had not been killed. They had been sealed, and for 10,000 years they slept, until the shard arrived. It pierced the crust like a blade, embedding itself within the deepest sanctum of the moon's labyrinth. The song it carried was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was familiar. A cadence only the untuned could feel, not with ears, but with soul echoes that stirred in the darkness. One by one, the sleepers opened their minds, not their eyes. They had no bodies anymore, only presence. In stasis cradles carved of forgotten psychoactive metals, the echoes of those lost minds began to resonate. They did not speak. They harmonized, and their chorus cracked the silence. The moon trembled, not physically, but in the warp. And when it did, something very old turned its gaze. On the bridge of a ship long since decommissioned, a black vessel that bore no livery, no heraldry, no name, a woman awoke from a dream she hadn't dreamed in centuries. Elandra. She had no rank, no world, no allegiance. Once, long ago, she had been part of the choir, but not just any voice. She had been the conductor, the one who shaped the songs of others, the one who silenced them when needed, the one who bore the burden of sacrifice. She had survived the sundering of the choir by embracing a lie, that she was no longer needed, that silence was mercy. Now, that silence was shattering. and she heard it, the note, the same note Vor had sent. It vibrated through her bones, through the ship's hull, through time, and with it came a memory, not of pain, but of her sisters, her brothers, the ones she had lulled into endless sleep. She saw their faces, heard their unfinished songs, and she knew. The Astronomicon was cracking, not in structure, but in purpose. The false light the Emperor had sustained for 10,000 years could not hold back the warp forever. The choir had been the first dam, its sacrifice, the first silence, but now the dam was breaking, and its pieces were calling to one another. Elandra stood from her suspended throne of steel and shadow. Her ship, a dead thing, a forgotten relic of Blackstone architecture, shuddered as her will returned to it, not with commands, but with song. She hummed, quietly, and the ship turned its prow toward the dead moon, toward the sepulchre, toward the waking voices of the untuned. She had heard their answer. She would gather them, not to revive the old choir, but to form a new one that would not serve the throne, one that would not bind its power to a single god corpse, but instead sing the truth of the warp back into the ears of mankind, to remind them that there were voices before the Emperor, and there would be voices after. Within the sepulchre, the keystone Vor had sent pulsed brighter. The shard burned with stored memory, with the screams of sacrifice, with the lullabies of mercy. And then it opened, not physically, but in the warp. And from it emerged a map, not of space, but of souls. It showed the remaining fragments of the choir, scattered across the Imperium. Some buried in tomb worlds, some twisted into servitor psychers, shackled to rogue navigator houses. Some, far worse, had become instruments of the black ships, each voice a broken string in a harp of agony, and all of them called out, not in words, but in desperate vibration, begging to be remembered. Elandra saw them, felt them. She would find them. She would bind them, not in chains, but in harmony, because she understood now what Vor had risked everything to say. The Emperor's plan had never been one of cruelty. It had been one of urgency. The warp could not be silenced, only sung to sleep, and only the choir could do that. Far away, in the solar system's heart, the throne world pulsed with anxiety. The astropaths screamed in their sleep. The Astronomicon flickered, not visibly, not yet, but subtly, like a breath withheld. And in the deep dungeons beneath Terra, where the Ordo Auris met in shadow, an alarm whispered into the ears of the Inquisitors. They had detected a pattern, a resonance, a song, and in the files no one dared to open, one name burned through the data like fire through parchment. Elandra. Status, deceased. Classification, heretic extremis. Designation, choir mistress of the 11th note. Action, immediate annihilation. But they were already too late. The song had escaped, and it could no longer be unsung. Long after the fires of the heresy cooled, and the bones of betrayal were buried beneath vitrified ash, there still lingered secrets beneath the ruined cities of Calth. It was a world once vibrant, blue seas, domed cities, and noble banners of Ultramar. But when the word bearers came, they brought not only war, but scripture of blood, and far below the surface, deeper than even the Ultramarines dared to return, a remnant still stirred. They had been hidden there by accident, or perhaps by fate. Not all of the choir perished in the burning of the Astronomicon's outer circles. Some had been stationed far afield, posted among the stars, not for service, but for silence. And when the heresy began, a small branch of the forgotten choir, 4 voices linked in thought and resonance, was trapped below Calth's catacombs, beneath bunkers, beneath vaults, beneath truth. There they sang not to the Astronomicon, but to one another, a harmony of endurance, of mourning, of memory. For 10,000 years their song continued, not in glory, not in fire, but in whispers. One of them still endured. Her name was Naivera. Once a child of terror, gifted and blind, she had been trained not to see, but to listen. Her gift was not power, but precision. Naivera could harmonize to warp frequencies so subtly that even the most sensitive psychers failed to detect her. She was silence cloaked in melody, and she had survived the sundering of her brethren not through strength, but by retreating into resonance, hiding her presence in the static of collapsed reality. She had not spoken aloud in millennia, but when the note came, Vor's note, the same note Elandra heard, the silence inside her cracked, not shattered, just cracked, enough to let in a fragment of remembrance, a chord, a fifth voice. She did not question it, did not fear it. She simply responded. She began to hum. One note, drawn out, ancient. And far away, in the black of the void, Elandra heard it. The journey to Calth was not short, nor was illegal. Elandra's ship had no warp trails, no identity, no allegiance. Only its blackstone hull, shaped like the bones of a forgotten leviathan, slipping silently through the sea of stars. She brought no army, only resonance, and in her mind she held the map of echoes drawn by Vor's keystone, lit by the soul songs of scattered survivors. Naivera's light shimmered faintly on that map, like a candle buried in the crust of a dying star. But it was enough. The choir was never meant to be many, only enough. Enough to hold the warp in place, to soothe the tides, to sing the madness to sleep. Calth's orbit was broken. Its sky still flickered with radiation from wars past. But beneath the crust, in a vault deeper than memory, Naivera waited. She could not move. Her physical form had long since fossilized into a throne of psionic awe. But her mind, it soared. And when Elandra descended into the deep, humming the ancient key of the 11th note, Naivera awakened, not physically, but in soul light. The cavern shimmered, wards that had not pulsed since the scouring glowed with shared rhythm, their two notes entwined, discordant at first, then aligned, and in the meeting of their resonance, something long buried surged forth. Memory, the memory of the first choir, before the Astronomicon, before the Emperor, before even Terra unified, when psychers did not serve, but sang. Naivera spoke through vibration. Elandra responded not in voice, but in conducting tone. Their communion lasted hours, days, or perhaps no time at all. They spoke not of war, nor of vengeance, but of return, not to power, not to thrones, but to purpose. And then Naivera's final body cracked, flaking into iridescent dust. Her soul, unfurled and free, flowed into the blackstone hull of Elandra's ship, like breath into an old flute. A second voice, two now, bound in harmony. And far away, across the Imperium, the note echoed once more. The map of echoes glowed anew. 3 more lights flared to life. The fragments were awakening. The dream Vor had carried in silence was rising. But not unnoticed. On Luna, within the hidden vaults of the Ordo Auris, alarm screamed in frequencies only psychers could feel. 3 choir points had harmonized, and a 4th was preparing to rise. The Inquisitors convened in panic. If 5 voices joined, if the choir reassembled, the Astronomicon could shift, its focus could bend, its obedience to the throne would be undone, and with it, the veil between real space and warp would thin, or worse, The choir might begin to sing for the warp itself, not to soothe it, but to awaken it. The Ordo Auris issued the order. Black protocol, severance. Every echo node must be destroyed. Every surviving member of the choir must be silenced. Even Elandra, especially Elandra. But she already knew. As she turned her ship from Calth's wounded orbit, a ripple passed through the warp, a final resonance, a dirge, not of mourning, but of gathering. The war for the soul of the choir was beginning, not with blades, but with voices, with song, with memory. And in that song, a question began to form. What happens when the Astronomicon sings a song the Emperor never wrote? The choir did not yet know the answer, but they would, soon. There is a map that no cartographer ever drew. No parchment bears its lines. No star charts contain its pathways. It is etched instead in resonance, traced in the lingering frequencies of souls long since forgotten by the Imperium. The map of echoes. Elandra did not find it. It found her. It had slumbered in Vor's broken psyche, its fragments spread across 10,000 years of silence, waiting for a note to awaken it. When Vor hummed the 11th note, when his fractured spirit was finally stilled in Elandra's presence, the map had shimmered awake like a forgotten constellation. It did not point to stars. It pointed to voices, lost voices, scattered remnants of the choir. Each node on the map was not a location, but a frequency, a pulse of psionic truth woven into the void itself. They flickered faintly now, 6 total, Elandra, Nevira, and 4 others, scattered like ancient runes across the galactic plane. But the Ordo Auris also saw them, and they did not see notes. They saw threats, not coordinates to follow, but targets to eliminate. For if the choir reunited, they would not need the Astronomicon. They would become something older, something purer, something terrifying. They would become a choir that sang without a throne. The next voice on the map pulsed in a spiral nebula near the dead forge world of Galantine Omega, a region scorched by plasma storms, avoided even by the Adeptus Mechanicus. But Elandra knew the song. It was erratic, fractured. The third voice was not like Nevira, not dormant, but mad, twisted by time, silence, and the bleed of the warp. It sang in shrieks, sudden flares of psionic distress punctuated by a sorrow too deep for the soul to endure. His name had once been Cantar Vane, the youngling conductor, a prodigy of the first choir, trained not to harmonize with the Astronomicon, but to shape its boundaries, to bend its notes, stretch its harmonics to reach systems beyond even the Emperor's gaze. Cantor had been the future, but when the choir was broken, he had been trapped alone in a resonance chamber for over 4 millennia, fed only recycled air and static hymns from a shattered Vox recording. His mind had turned inward and fractured. He now sang to ghosts, to echoes of echoes, to fragments of lost harmony stitched together in a patchwork symphony of loneliness. Elandra knew she had to reach him, but the Ordo Auris reached him first. On Galantine Omega, deep within a ruined choir spire buried beneath centuries of ash, Cantar stood alone in a circle of decayed resonators. The walls wept dust, the air trembled, and in the center he spun, eyes closed, voice trembling. He sang not to be heard. He sang so he wouldn't forget how. When the kill team arrived, draped in null shrouds, wielding psychic silencers and blades of anti-resonance, he welcomed them. He thought they were new choirlings. He bowed, offered his name. Cantar Vane, in faithful resonance I return. They did not reply. They struck, but his voice had not withered. It had only changed. And in that instant, The ruins trembled. The old resonators, tuned to the warp ages ago, awakened. Not fully, not by design, but enough. Kantar's scream became a pulse, a chaotic wave of shattering sound that melted the null shrouds from their bones. 3 of the 8 assassins disintegrated, the rest staggered, bleeding from eyes, ears, and soul. He screamed again, and the walls sang back. But they were trained killers. They did not need harmony to kill, only cold steel and blind obedience. As they raised their weapons, preparing to sever his voice forever, Elandra arrived. She did not speak. She simply sang a single, clear, sustained note, the 5th harmony of terror. It was the lullaby of the choir's birth, the song that the Emperor himself had once hummed into the soul of old night, a tone older than war, older than wrath. Kantar collapsed, not from pain, from memory. His fractured psyche swam with recognition. He began to weep. "You remember the song," he whispered, and then he smiled, just as a blade from the final assassin curved through the smoke toward Elandra's spine. But before it struck, another voice joined hers, Naivira. Her note flared like a beacon, warping the air, disrupting the silencer's trajectory mid-flight. And from the very ground itself, the ruined psionic metal sang in unison. The assassin disintegrated in a burst of nullified potential. Only Elandra and Kantar remained. 2 voices breathing. The 3rd and final node of the ancient triad rejoined. And in the warp, something stirred. Something vast. Not chaos, not order, but song. The choir was forming chords again. Back aboard her vessel, Elandra stood in the psionic chamber, the map of echoes pulsing in her mind. 3 lights burned steady now, 3 tones in harmony, and with the 3rd node joined, the map revealed its next truth, a central convergence point, a nexus of forgotten resonance hidden in Segmentum Pacificus, beneath a dead cathedral once guarded by the Silent Sisterhood. It had been thought collapsed, but it was not empty. It housed the anchor, the final keystone of the original choir. Without it, they could not ascend. With it, they could reclaim the lost frequencies of the Astronomicon, not to destroy it, but to liberate it, to make it sing for all, not for one throne, not for one god, but for every soul lost in the dark. But word had spread. The Ordo Auris no longer acted in shadows. They had declared vocal extremis, a full-scale psychic purge. Choir remnants were now considered existential threats. The ecclesiarchy stirred. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica tightened their coils. And aboard the Golden Throne, the Emperor's inert form flickered for the briefest moment, not in response, but in resonance. His ancient soul, dimmed but not extinguished, felt something. Not rebellion, not war, but a song he had not heard since the beginning. And perhaps, just perhaps, he remembered. Elandra turned from the map of echoes, her face lit by its pulse. Naivira's voice hovered like a second heart within her. Kantar, now silent but whole, knelt nearby, relearning his pitch, whispering fragments of notes he once thought lost. They had no army, no banners, no war machines, only voices, 3 so far, and a 4th calling from the edge of the map, where time bent and memory burned. They would go to her next, but first they would rest and sing, not loudly, not yet, but enough to be heard by those who still remembered. The choir was no longer forgotten. It was forming, and its song would shake the stars. There is a room beneath the Emperor's palace that no chart dares map, no custodian dares name. It is not marked in the archives, nor remembered by those who have passed through it. They forget it the moment they leave, and yet the room remembers them. They call it the chamber of echoes, though none know why. It is not for sound. No voice is raised here. It is for memory, for the residue of truth. And when Elandra Vale entered it once more, her null aura dimmed, her breath slow and trembling, she understood the chamber's curse. It did not show the past. It made you feel it. The floor was inscribed with psychic lattice work, older than the throne, older perhaps than the Emperor's very reign. Veins of soulstone crisscrossed the chamber, pulsing with the fading lights of minds long devoured by the warp. Elandra stepped barefoot across them, not out of reverence, but penance. She had brought with her the last surviving echo of the choir, the soul thread harvested from the black reliquary. As she placed it into the chamber's core, the lattice responded, flaring to life in a whisper of golden fire. Memory flooded back into the room, not as voices but as weight. The psychic impression of thousands of deaths layered upon each other like dust. She felt their fear, she felt their faith, and she felt the moment it all broke. A child screamed, not aloud, but within her mind. A choir boy no older than 10, plucked from some backworld shrine and promised purpose. He had sung not with joy, but desperation. His voice was one of the last that had sustained the Astronomicon before the rupture. Then came the fire. Then came silence. Elandra dropped to her knees. A null by nature, she was not meant to feel such things. But the chamber disregarded her defenses, slicing through her silence like a knife through parchment. The echoes did not seek her permission. They demanded her understanding. She saw now that the Astronomicon was never just a light. It was a graveyard, burning with the brilliance of martyrdom. And somewhere within it, deeper than even the sisters had known, lay a second pulse, subtle, secret, surgical. The Astronomicon was guiding ships, yes, but it was also transmitting something else. A pattern, a resonance, a forgotten voice, broadcast endlessly across the stars. It was him, not the living emperor, but the memory of what he once was, carved into the souls of the choir, carried across the void like a hymn, a false beacon, a shadow of the father of mankind, and someone was using it. As Elandra stood, reeling, the chamber shifted. The lattice rearranged itself, forming a psychic glyph, the mark of the sigillite. Malcador, the Emperor's most trusted servant. His soul was gone, scattered to the void during the final days of the siege. But his echoes lingered here. A voice spoke, not Malcador's, not the Emperor's, but something synthesized from both, a thought machine, a soul construct. You seek the truth, it said, but truth was never the purpose. Purpose was the purpose, and the cost was always known. Elandra's hand went to her sword, but she did not draw it. One does not fight echoes with blades. What was the choir? She whispered. The voice replied, a sacrifice. For the throne? No, for the illusion, for the dream. The lattice began to collapse, fire running backward through the veins of memory, erasing itself with gentle finality. The soul thread was gone now, consumed, assimilated, but its meaning remained, etched into Elandra's mind like scars into flesh. Above her, unseen, the Inquisitor Kestel watched through a surveillance link. He had accessed the feed through unsanctioned channels, bypassing the Ordo's own command protocols. What he saw made him tremble. He now knew what the Astronomicon truly was. A psychic lighthouse, a soul machine, and a vault for a lie so vast it spanned the galaxy. It was not only the ships of the Imperium that navigated by its light, the faithful did too. Every prayer, every act of sacrifice, every moment of belief, it all gravitated toward the Astronomicon. It was not simply a guide. It was an anchor, and what it anchored was breaking free. Back in the chamber, Elandra turned toward the exit. As she did, she saw a shape watching her from the shadows, a figure clad in white and gold, face hidden beneath a mask of bone. An old sister, one she had buried years ago. But the dead did not remain still in the chamber of echoes. Not when the truth stirred. The figure spoke without sound, mouthing words only Elandra could understand. They are coming for the light. Then the chamber darkened, and the stars, far above Terra, flickered. In the great silence that followed the chamber's collapse, Terra itself seemed to hold its breath. Far above the ruins of memory and psionic machinery, the towers of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica reached into the heavens like spires of morning. Within them, the last functioning choirs continued their songs, not of joy or enlightenment, but of duty, of pain, of necessity, and in the hollows between those voices, something stirred. They called it the Vox Maledictum, the cursed voice, a rumour first, a heresy second, and now a certainty. The Vox was not a person, nor a demon. It was a pattern, a resonance, an echo older than the Imperium itself. Carried within the psychic winds that fed the Astronomicon, it rode upon the waves of soul light, whispering across the warp to those who knew how to listen. And someone had listened. Inquisitor Kestel stood before a soul-hollow mirror within the vaults of the silent chamber, a clandestine sect of the Ordo Hereticus, known only to the High Lords and the Sigillites' final successor. The mirror was crafted from the obsidian bones of long-dead psychers, its surface quivering with whispers when uncovered. Kestel asked the mirror a question he had no right to voice. Who speaks beneath the throne? The mirror did not answer with words. Instead, it wept. Its surface ran with golden tears, condensed thoughts of the dead. And in the center, an image bloomed. A girl, no more than 17, her eyes hollowed, her tongue severed, her body wrapped in ceremonial silks, bearing the sigil of the Imperium. Not as honor, but as chain. She was one of the first choir, and though she had no voice, her message screamed into Kestel's mind like a nova. The Emperor is not alone. He staggered back. The chamber flickered. Sanity, like light, retreated. Elsewhere, beneath the Basilica of St. Pyra, Sister Elandra knelt within a sanctum lined with ossuaries and black-inked histories. The bones of the choir were buried here, those who had served and perished in silence, their names replaced by designations and numbers. She held in her hands the skull of one who had sung at the dawn of the Imperium. Its eye sockets were carved with sacred inscriptions, prayers etched into bone by penitent scribes. But beneath the prayers, she saw something else. Runes, sigils of pre-imperial origin, xenos. No, something worse. Human, but divergent, forgotten. The lost dialect of the 10,000 Voiceless, a sect that had once worshipped silence as divine music, heretics even by ancient standards. And yet, here they were, encoded in the skull of a choir boy who had died for the light. The realization settled like poison in her lungs. The Astronomicon had not been built merely from technology or power. It had been built from stolen faiths, suppressed rites, forbidden dreams. The Emperor had crafted it from the bones of 100 discarded truths, blending them into one unbearable certainty, that only his will mattered. And now, something beneath that will, something buried for 10,000 years, was waking. Back in the mirror chamber, Kestel's hand hovered over the activation glyph for the Vox protocol, a forbidden communion ritual that would allow him to speak directly into the Astronomicon's echo. not control it, not alter it, but beg for audience. "Don't," came a voice behind him. He turned. Elandra stood there, eyes haunted, robe stained from the ashes of the ossuary. "You found it," he said. "I found nothing," she answered. "Only loss." They looked at each other, two heretics in all but name, a null and an inquisitor, both standing before a relic no sane soul would approach. The mirror shimmered again, showing a constellation neither recognized. It pulsed. 1, 2, 3. "Is that a signal?" Kestel whispered. "No," said Elandra. "It's a heartbeat." The pulse quickened. 3, 3, 3. She drew her blade, not to fight, but to remember, to feel something real, something solid, in the sea of unraveling truth. Then, for the first time in 10,000 years, the Vox Maledictum spoke. Not in low Gothic, not in the high cant of terror. It spoke in forgotten unity, a language of thought and pain and starlight. "We were the choir. We were the light. We are the silence you abandoned. And now, we remember you." The room shattered, not physically, but in the warp. The mirror cracked across 7 dimensions. Kestel fell to his knees, blood leaking from his eyes, his name burned from his mind. Elandra remained standing. She felt the message, not as speech, but as judgment. The choir was not dead, it was displaced, scattered across the warp, forgotten, fragmented, but never extinguished. And now its pieces were coalescing, in dreams, in deaths, in the silence between the stars. The Emperor had burned them for fuel, but he had not erased them. And now, as his own mind faded into the abyss, they were rising in the vacuum of his absence. The Astronomicon still burned, but it flickered now, subtly, unnaturally, as if someone else were tuning it, reaching in, reclaiming their place. Elandra turned to Kestel, whose breath came in ragged gasps. "We need to go," she said. "Where?" "Where the choir first sang." "Before Terra, before the throne. You mean?" She nodded. "Luna." And as the Astronomicon pulsed again, across 1,000,000 worlds, every astropath dreamt the same thing. A room of children, a song of sorrow, and a voice, not the Emperor's, but one that had once called him brother. Luna, the moon that bore the first wars of unification, the dead heart of Earth's first blood rites. Before the Imperium, before the Emperor, before even the war in the Webway, Luna had been a place of silence. Now it was a mausoleum, not of bodies, but of truths. Elandra Vale stepped onto the broken regolith of Luna's shadowed side, beneath a sky where no light reached. Her ship, silent, blackstone-ribbed, and psionically cloaked, hung still above the surface, its hull thrumming with the notes of 3 choir souls within. Nevera, the seer of silence. Kantar, the mad youngling turned gentle. And Vor, the first echo, now fully awakened within her own mind. They had come not to reclaim anything, but to listen. The song that was never heard still lingered here, etched into the very crust of the lunar soil, where the first choirlings were bound in ritual, not to serve the Emperor, but to understand him, before the throne, before the lie. The Librarium Obscura called it the Null Womb. It was never officially named in any imperial doctrine. The place where the Emperor's earliest psychers were gestated, shaped, and offered up, only to be discarded when the choir became a weapon rather than a voice. Here, the choir had first been born, and here, Elandra intended to let them die properly. She entered the hollow cradle alone. Its walls were obsidian veined with psychoreactive glass, mirrors that showed not reflection, but memory. As she passed, Each panel flickered with remnants of forgotten lives. A boy screaming inside a golden sarcophagus. A girl humming a lullaby in a forgotten dialect of old earth. A twin crying as her sister was sacrificed to sustain a single flare of the Astronomicon. Elandra wept silently as she walked, but she did not stop. At the chamber's core, a crystalline altar pulsed with dormant resonance. The final note. It had waited here, encoded into the bedrock, never sung, meant only to be heard in the moment the Astronomicon failed, the failsafe, the dirge of the choir's reckoning. Vor had once dreamt of this note, but no one had ever dared play it, because it was not a song of light, it was a song of ending. She placed her hand upon the altar. Naevira and Kantar joined her in psionic form, shimmering like translucent motes of blue light, their voices warm but grave. "We are not many," said Naevira. "We were never meant to be," said Kantar. "Then let us be enough," whispered Elandra. And they began to sing. The final note was not loud. It did not quake the earth. It did not fracture the sky. It was soft. A hum like a child remembering the shape of their mother's voice. A vibration that threaded itself into the core of the Astronomicon, reaching through the warp, not to destroy, not to rebel, but to return, to release. And far across the stars, the Astronomicon flickered. For the first time in 10,000 years, its light dimmed, not because of failure, but because it was listening. The Emperor stirred upon the golden throne, not in body, but in soul. His thoughts, fractured into a trillion shards across the warp, turned briefly toward the song, and he remembered, not the Great Crusade, not the heresy, not his betrayal or his sons. He remembered the first time he had heard a child sing, back when he still walked as a man, back when he still believed in hope. His soul wept, and in that moment of weeping, the choir's purpose was fulfilled. They had not come to usurp the Emperor. They had come to remind him that the Imperium was built on silence, on crushed voices, on erased names, and that nothing built on such bones could sing forever. The aftermath was not cataclysmic. The Astronomicon did not shatter, but it changed. Its frequency shifted subtly. The navigators felt it instantly, like a song they had heard in childhood, forgotten, then recalled. Not discordant, just human. Some warp storms began to part. Others grew darker, angrier. The eye of terror pulsed, as if something ancient and imprisoned within had heard the note, and smiled. The Ordo Auris collapsed within a week. The last High Inquisitor of the Choir Purge walked into the sea of dust on Terra and was never seen again. The silent chamber was sealed. The Librarium Obscura declared the choir never existed. But some remembered. Some still hear the final note in their sleep. They wake weeping, not knowing why. They stare at stars that seem closer than before. They feel the weight of a truth never taught. And across the Imperium, astropaths began to hum to themselves, not in defiance, but in mourning, in memory, and in hope. Elandra never returned to Terra. She vanished into the warp with her blackstone vessel, now carrying the full resonance of the restored choir. 4 voices, now 1. They drift through systems that lost the light long ago, singing only to guide the forgotten home. No banners, no empire, only song. Some say she has become a myth, a warp siren, a false saint. But others, those who believe, say she is the first voice of something new. Not the Imperium, not chaos, but something else. A future where voices are not weapons, but wounds made sacred. A future where the Astronomicon does not blind, but illuminates. A future not yet written, but already sung. softly, patiently, truthfully, for those still lost in the void, for those still waiting to come home, for you, always for you.